On July 5th of 2018, police were called to the scene of something awful that occurred at a house in Australia. A neighbor said he heard 4 bangs from next door, which sounded like gunshots, and when police went inside the home to check if everything was okay, what they would find would absolutely shock an entire city. This is the evil case of John Edwards. Hello, friend, and welcome to High Time Crime. My name's Joel, and on here I specialize in true crime and also being able to read minds. I know what you're thinking right now. Grilled cheese would be perfect. Ugh, why am I still lactose intolerant? But anyway, today we're going over the case of John Edwards and what he did on that terrible July day. I just want to say that this is one of the more sad and heinous crimes that I've covered, and that this man was just a ticking time bomb. For our story, we're heading to Australia, and specifically West Pennant Hills, which is a suburb in the Hills district of Sydney, New South Wales. With a population of around 13,000-ish people, it's a decent place to live, named after an ornithologist and zoologist from the 1700s named Thomas Pennant. It's got some very interesting history to the area, but I'm not a history teacher, and that's not why we're here today. John Edwards was born on July 12th of 1950 in Broken Hill, a city in Australia. Not too much is known about his early childhood, but his only sister, Diane, said that he was an awful man who was irritable and reclusive. At the age of 17, he stole his mother's car and ran away from home. He did leave a letter behind, though, saying goodbye. After this, he did a ton of different jobs and even served with the Australian Defence Force. Eventually, John qualified to be a Commando Green Beret on June 30th of 1983, and by 1989, he was discharged from the Army Reserve. Apparently, he had been held captive at one point, but I'm not sure how true that is. So now we're gonna travel back a bit and go in a chronological order of how awful this man was. John had married several women over the years and genuinely mistreated everyone. His actions from 1968 to 2018 were just absolutely atrocious. In 1968, John met his first wife, who we'll call Ashley. He was 18 years old and she was 17. Together, they had 2 children, a daughter and a son. By August of 1972, the couple would get married. Now, for those past 4 years, things were actually pretty normal, and John didn't seem to be terrible. As soon as they got married, though, something really changed. Around that time, he began to become very controlling over what Ashley would do, and this included limiting the amount of money that he would give her for groceries. Ashley also said that John was often very unpredictable. About a year would pass, and in 1973 or 1974, John, Ashley, and their 2 children went on a vacation to the United States. While they were there, they went to Boston, Massachusetts. Somehow, John must have gotten some alone time or something, because he roamed the city, and when he did, he met another woman. Right away, they started writing each other love letters, and, well, Ashley found one of those letters. She was devastated and decided to leave John and go home to Australia. Ashley wanted to take both of the children, but John told her she could only take one. She ended up taking their son while John kept their daughter. A few months would go by, and John wrote Ashley a letter asking her to travel to the United States to bring their daughter back to Australia. Ashley then went and got their daughter, and brought her back home. John ended up getting married again in 1974 or 1975, and by then he returned to Australia with his new wife and her daughter. He didn't get divorced from Ashley just quite yet, so I'm not exactly sure how that marriage worked. Another year would go by, though, and John decided to divorce this woman that he got married to, and her daughter returned back to the United States. That must have been terrible, though. You marry someone, move all the way across the world, and within about a year, they just abandon you. Yikes. But anyway, a few years would pass, and on June 24th of 1977, John and Ashley were officially divorced, and for some reason, John was given everything that Ashley owned. Ashley was given parental rights for both of their children, and John was allowed to visit them every other weekend. Now, John, to both of these children, was a horrible father. He physically assaulted them on numerous occasions, and one time, when his son was on his way to school, John decided to kidnap him and take him to a hotel against his will in an attempt to gain custody of him. Obviously, that didn't work. Still, in 1977, John started a relationship with another woman who we'll call Carol. Well, John and Carol would go on to have a daughter in 1979. A few years later, in 1982 or 1983, Carol tried to leave John because he was hitting her. At the time, she was about 4 months pregnant with their second child. Carol went to have a checkup on the baby and found out that she had lost it because of John. By 1984, John and Carol got married, and in 1985, they had a son together. So just to fully catch you up, I'll do this again down the line. John has now had 3 wives and a total of 4 children, 2 sons and 2 daughters. It would be 5 total, but because of what he did, it was 4. John's behavior with his second wife, Carol, was awful and only continued to get worse. On one occasion, he ran a cigarette lighter along a wooden table and asked Carol if he should set the house on fire. This was while both of them and their children were sitting in the living room. In 1987, Carol had finally had enough of John and what he was doing. One day, he threw a rolling pin at her, and so Carol took her kids to the next door neighbor's house and called the police. John and Carol would then end up separating, but John began to do some really alarming things. One day, when it was his time to watch their son, John took him and didn't return him until days later. Carol called the police, but they refused to intervene because of some reason involving family law proceedings. In another, totally unrelated instance, Carol called the police once again on John after he parked his car in front of her driveway. Carol, her sister, and the children were going away on holidays, but John didn't want that to happen, and he did everything he could to try and stop it. A few years would go by, and in December of 1993, Carol went and got an apprehended violence order against John, and his children stopped talking to him a few years later. Now, in 1989, John was about 40 years old when he met another woman who we'll call Denise. She was only 21 years old. That same year, within basically no time of meeting each other, Denise became pregnant with a boy. In 1990, she ended up having that child, but by that point, she ended things with John. It's not exactly clear as to why, but we can assume some things. In 1990 still, John put an ad out in the newspaper that was for single people. By now, he was a lonely man who was a deadbeat father. He wasn't a good person, and this will continue to show and only get worse and worse, especially starting now. John's third ex-wife, Carol, called his first ex-wife, Ashley, and told her that she was lucky to be alive because she had stopped John coming to shoot her with a gun. She said he was going to kill her and her father, and he hated her father, that she was terrified. But a woman who we'll call Erica ended up answering John's ad in the newspaper, and they hit it off. A year would pass, and in 1991, they had a son together. But while Erica was 5 months pregnant, John told her that he wanted nothing to do with her anymore, and he broke up with her. About 3 months would pass, and when Erica was 8 months pregnant, her and John reconciled, and she moved back in with him. She said that he slept with a machete beside their bed, and one time said that people like him were not supposed to have guns. Erica was confused by this statement, but just kept it going. Several months would go by, and in 1992, Erica sold her house because John told her to, and he asked for her to give him money to help with his divorce settlement with his second wife, Carol. Erica had said to a friend that she felt very frightened of John and that she felt alone, so she decided to give him $120,000. Erica also became very ill while living with John because of the amount of stress he put on to her. Erica ended up losing a ton of weight and at one point got down to only 88 pounds or 40 kilograms. John would berate her and say awful things to her, and that was only the half of it. Some time would go by and Erica decided enough was enough and that she was going to leave John. And she was also going to take their son with her, and so she did and moved into an apartment. Over the next several years, John would do some awful things to Erica and their son. They shared custody of him, and John also had part-time custody of all of his other children. John would use a belt to whip them if they ever did anything wrong. On one occasion in 1993, John went to Erica's apartment without telling her he was going to, and told her he wanted to take their son. And so he did. He literally ripped him out of Erica's hands. One time, John had once again went to Erica's without saying anything, and this time he kicked down her door because she wasn't answering. After this, she felt so terrified of him and was afraid that he was going to do something even crazier. And so she began to just let him inside when he would show up. In 1996, Erica decided to move pretty far away from John with their son, and over the next 4 years until 2000, John was still showing up without telling her, but this time it would be in the middle of the night. One day, he did that, and so Erica tried to call the police, but John ripped the phone off the wall. On February 17th of 1997, John called Erica several times, and she got really scared that he was going to show up and hurt her and take their son. So she took her son and went to the police station and filed a report. From 1997 to 1999, John tried calling Erica on numerous occasions, but he wouldn't speak if their son answered the phone. By 2001, their son was 10 years old, and he decided that he didn't want to see John anymore, so he didn't. In 2002, on one random day, John once again showed up to Erica's house unannounced and tried to get inside. Erica didn't let him because she was afraid for both her and her son's safety. After this, both John and Erica decided to try to attend classes to reconnect him to their son, but it didn't work, and so in 2002, they stopped talking completely. This same year, John's daughter also passed away tragically, and his first son also cut off all contact with him. So we're going to go back a decent bit to 1996 because of some other relationships John was in. This year, he started to see the mother of his third son, or Denise, again. John began to pressure her to move in with him, but she didn't want to go. 2 years would go by, and on May 3rd of 1998, John called Denise and asked her to come over because he wanted to see their son. Denise talked to one of her friends about this, and her friend had a great intuition because she warned her not to go. Denise ended up going anyway, and she got to John's house at about 8 p.m. And over the course of several hours, John yelled at her and hit her. The next day, on May 4th, Denise went to the police station and filed a report. John ended up getting charged with common assault this same day, and an apprehended violence order was applied to help protect Denise from John. On September 2nd of 1998, both John and Denise went to court because of this, and for some reason, the charges were dropped. I find that absolutely ridiculous. After this, for the next few years, they would stop talking, but we'll bring up Denise again in a little bit. Still in the year 1998, John met another woman who we'll call Faith. Now, before we get into their relationship, let's catch you up. John has had 3 wives and 2 girlfriends with a total of 6 children, 4 boys and 2 girls. Now, with Faith, they got married at the end of 1998. In January of 1999, John told Faith that she has to get out of his house, and the reason being was that he was going through court proceedings with an ex. They stayed married and very much together, but Faith did leave the house. The next month, in February, John asked Faith if she would have a baby with him, and she agreed. By April of this same year, Faith ended up getting pregnant. Sometime in June, the couple discovered that they were going to have a boy, and this made John furious. He wanted to have a girl, and so when they found out that information, John asked Faith to get an abortion. She refused, and so he decided to stop talking to her for several weeks. In July, still 1999, Faith was about 3 months pregnant, and she made a visit to John's home. While here, he threw a phone at her and pushed her around very hard. She was terrified that she was going to lose the baby. But in December of that year, Faith was 9 months pregnant and ready to give birth. She started having contractions, and so she asked John to drive her to the hospital, and he began yelling at her. Eventually, he would drive her to the hospital after their argument, and he literally just left her there by herself. Faith ended up having to have their son together alone. A month or so would go by, and in January of 2000, Faith began living at a woman's shelter with her newborn son to try and get away from John. The workers here urged her to report what he was doing to the police, and soon she did. The police didn't take her seriously because, for the most part, John was mentally and emotionally manipulative, not always physically. Another few weeks would pass, and John somehow found out where Faith and their son was at, and he asked her to leave the shelter and come home with him to be a family. The workers here told Faith that this was a bad idea, but she went anyway and quickly found out it was a terrible idea. Faith moved in with John, and he then tried to make her agree to a temporary divorce by saying he was going to get their son taken away from her. Faith told him okay, but she then went to a lawyer who told her not to sign anything. Don't trust John and leave him immediately. For a very long time, John would harass Faith at any angle he could, over the phone, in person, on the internet, trying to get her to sign divorce papers. One time in August of 2000, John found Faith at a store and then trailed her while he was driving and while she was walking. He was yelling out the window at her, that he was going to have their son taken away from her. On August 15th, Faith got an apprehended violence order against John, and it was granted for a time frame of 3 years. By September of 2000, the married couple was now divorced, and John was completely out of Faith and their son's lives. Unfortunately, in December of 2003, Faith's son was diagnosed with Batten's disease, and 5 years later, at the age of 8 years old, he would pass away in September of 2008. Okay, so to finally completely catch you up on everything, at this point, John has had 4 wives and 2 girlfriends and was awful to each and every one of them. Together with all of them, he had 7 children, 5 boys and 2 girls, and 2 of them had passed away because of tragic events. As you've already heard, John's history with women has been absolutely atrocious, but things are going to ramp up to an extreme level. In October of 2000, about a month or so after getting divorced with his previous wife, John started going on international dating websites at the age of 50. He met a woman named Olga who was 19 years old and lived in Russia. It's said that John loved Russia and afterwards visited there several times, but with Olga, a questionable difference in age, though this didn't stop them, and eventually in 2001, John visited Russia to meet her. I'm guessing things went pretty well, but after John went back home to Australia, he wasn't exactly loyal. Once he got back, he started messaging his ex, Denise, and asked her if he could move in with her and start all over again. At this same time, he was also messaging his ex-girlfriend, Erica, and trying to bring Olga to Australia from Russia. What an absolute yikes. This man was playing so many people. But in August of 2001, Olga was actually able to move to Australia. A few months would go by, and on November 10th of 2001, the couple got married. About a year would pass, and on September 12th of 2002, they had their first child together, a boy named Jack John Edwards. Another 2 years would go by, and on August 14th of 2004, the couple had a daughter named Jennifer Angel Edwards. Now, for the first few years of their marriage, John had actually been somewhat of a good guy and didn't show that many worrying signs. But once their daughter was born, everything changed. John started to go back to his old behavior that we've already seen him display with his previous wives. He started to become very controlling and angry at Olga, and this was because of what she would wear and how she would do her makeup. When he was mad, John would constantly give her the silent treatment because of that, and Olga would end up crying and begging him to forgive her. Now we'll fast forward a little bit, and in 2010, John went with Olga to apply for a firearms license. One of the questions he was asked was if he's had a domestic violence order in the past 10 years. John answered no, but he was lying because he did have one. He ended up being sent a refusal letter for this, but trust me when I say John's journey for a gun has only just begun. Still in the year 2010, John was 60 years old and a menace. Now, if you remember, he had an ex-wife named Carol, and they had a daughter together who we'll call Jasmine. Jasmine was born in either 1982 or 1983, so at this time she was about 29. When Jasmine was 17, though, she stopped all contact with John, as did most of his children. Well, in June of 2010, John decided to hire a private investigator to find Jasmine. The private investigator did, and he gave John a ton of details about Jasmine, which included her address and full name because she had gotten married and changed it. Almost a year would go by, and on May 4th of 2011, John, along with a friend, went to an open house. Guess who was selling this house? His daughter, Jasmine. Her and her husband put their house up for sale with the hopes of moving overseas. While John and his friend were at this open house, one of the real estate agents found him in one of Jasmine's children's room looking at pictures on the wall. The real estate agent thought that this seemed suspicious. About a week would pass, and Jasmine was at home alone with her children when she noticed someone trying to put an envelope under the front door of her house. It was a man that she did not know, and when she opened the door, this man gave her an envelope and then ran away. When Jasmine started to look at this envelope, she recognized John's handwriting and got terrified. She closed the front door and locked it and grabbed her children because she was afraid of what John was going to do. Jasmine then opened the envelope and read the letter inside, and it basically just said that John had a friend who offered to find out where she was for him. Jasmine was scared out of her mind and called her husband and asked him to come home from work. Literally, only a few days would pass, and while she was taking her daughter to preschool, John came out from nowhere and confronted her. Jasmine was so frightened that she put her daughter back into her car, got into the front seat, and locked the doors. John then attempted to open the door, and Jasmine told him to stay away from her family and that if he doesn't leave her alone, she's going to get a domestic violence order against him, and she then quickly sped off. After this happened, Jasmine didn't return home for the day and spent it at a family member's house, but when she did return to her home on May 16th of 2011, she opened her mailbox and found a letter from John. The first thing that was written was, "Jasmine, regarding the violence order, please read this letter." The next day, on May 17th, Jasmine went to the police station and talked to them about John stalking her. The police decided they wouldn't pursue stalking charges because John only tried to get into contact with Jasmine 3 times and that they believe a DVO will suffice. The police set a hearing for May 31st, and on May 25th, John sent another letter to Jasmine trying to tell her why he started to look for her, and he asked her to forgive him. She obviously didn't care and did not forgive him. Another week would go by, and on May 31st, both Jasmine and John attended court. During this hearing, at one point in time, the police prosecutor leaned over to Jasmine and whispered, "He's your father. Can't you just sort this out amongst yourselves?" Which is an absolutely awful thing to say to someone. It wasn't just her father, but a man that she really didn't know and did not want to know. John did not like what the court had to say, and he definitely did not agree with it. And so the court set another hearing for later down the line. This court date would not be needed, though, because Jasmine and her husband were able to sell their house and move overseas. No longer would she have to deal with John anymore. But John is really just getting started. In 2012, he was still with his wife, Olga, but progressively becoming worse as a person. He began to hurt his children around this time, and when his son Jack was around 10 years old, he really started to get angry at him specifically. John would physically and verbally assault him, and at one point in time, he threw a book at him and gave him a cut under his eye. Fast forward another year, and in 2013, Jack was now 11 years old, and on multiple occasions, he tried to call the police because of John. This was prevented by Olga, however, because she wanted to protect John. For the next several years, things got even worse, and John continued to ramp up his awful behavior to Jack. One day, Jack was talking to Olga, and he told her that he kept a bat in his room to protect himself from John, and Jennifer told her that she kept a butter knife under her pillow and that she would never turn her back to John. In the year 2015, the Edwards family took a trip to Paris, and John and Jack got into it again. At this point, Jack was 13 years old, and for some reason, John chased him out of the hotel and down the road. Once he caught up to him, he held him against the wall and began to choke him. People who were walking by had to stop John. A few months would pass, and in November of that year, Jack touched John's cell phone when John asked him not to. Because of this, John started to chase Jack around when he eventually got him into a corner and started to beat him up. He gave him a bloody nose, and when that was all over, Olga had begged Jack to not call the police, which is very sad to think about. But anyways, things are about to really become bad starting pretty soon. In December of 2015, John's behavior towards not only his son and his daughter, but his wife started to ramp up. He was controlling Olga and everything she did and started going days with ignoring her and the children. On Christmas Day of 2015, Olga told John that she wanted a divorce. John began apologizing and begged Olga to stay with him, saying that he'll change. Olga agreed to this, but told him that if he screwed up again, she was gone. A few more weeks would go by, and in January of 2016, absolutely nothing changed. John was still doing the exact same things. One day in January, Jack had ran away from home, and John reported him as a missing person to the police, who eventually found him at 3:30 a.m. the next day. Jack told the police he ran away from home because of John. When Jack was brought back by the police, John continued to hurt him physically. He also continued to control everything Olga did, which included him getting her paychecks and giving her a budget for groceries. That was it. John, however, was allowed to do whatever he wanted with his money and his wife's money. Another few months would go by, and in March of 2016, Olga finally had enough of John's antics and decided to leave him. On March 11th, her and the two children moved out of their home that they lived in with John and into a friend's house. Olga was terrified that John was going to hurt her because she took the children away, as she had somehow known about John's previous history with women. After this, John decided to change the locks on their house and sent a letter to Olga's friend that she was with saying thank you for watching his family, which for Olga and the kids would have been so scary because she did not tell John where she was going. A few days later, on March 14th, Olga and the children somehow met up with John, and the police were called because Olga and John started having an argument. The police said that it was a no-offense verbal argument, and Jack and Jennifer were giving ratings as children of risk, but they were deemed to be at no significant risk of no significant harm. Obviously, that would prove to be not true. A month would go by, and on April 6th of 2016, Olga went to court to try and get custody for their children. On April 28th, John called Child Protection Services on Olga and said the children were at risk. He just did that to mess with her. The next month, in May and June of 2016, John started to see a psychologist who said that he was clinically depressed because of his wife leaving him and that he has thoughts of taking his own life, but doesn't necessarily want to die. He was diagnosed with PTSD. On June 1st, John filed an affidavit telling the court that he was seeing a psychologist and had been diagnosed with PTSD. The next day, on June 2nd, the judge issued that John must stay 500 meters or 1,640 feet away from the children. John obviously didn't agree to this order, and over the next year, his behavior becomes even more disturbing. On June 5th, still 2016, Olga asked her boss David to come with her to John's house so she could grab some of her belongings. When they got there, John started pushing David to prevent him from going inside, and so David said he accidentally pushed John's shoulder while entering, and John fell backwards. John then went to the police station to report an assault, and the police said they didn't have enough evidence to charge David. 3 weeks later, on June 21st, John called the police to report that someone broke into his house and that their name was Olga. Once again, he did this to mess with her. A few months went by, and on September 8th of 2016, Jack once again ran away from home after getting into an argument with John. The police found him the next morning, and he told them that he ran away because of his parents arguing. The next month, starting in October of 2016, Olga and the children began seeing a psychologist after the court asked them to. Olga had told the counselor that John was a very abusive person and that she and the children were afraid of him. From October until January of the next year, he started showing up places where he knew Jack and Jennifer would be, even though he wasn't invited or supposed to be there. A few instances were the fact that he went to both of the children's schools. He showed up to Jennifer's 6th grade graduation and tried to give her a dog, and he accidentally ran into Jack at a train station trying to hand him a letter. John was stalking his children and ex-wife to a very, very dangerous degree. In early December of 2016, he once again hired a private investigator, but this time for them to follow Olga to her job and wherever else she went to see if she was dating someone else. A few weeks would pass, and on December 29th, Olga went to the police station and reported assaults on Jack and Jennifer committed by John. The police did not take her seriously, and they said that there was no offense detected. So Olga liked to do yoga and had started in about early 2013, attending nearly 3 classes a week. She felt very safe and comfortable there, and she referred to it as her sanctuary. Well, still, in December of 2016, John sent Olga a letter telling her that he is going to be attending the same exact yoga studio that she does. Olga didn't bother reading this letter because John already sent her a ton of them. Well, between January 2017 to February 8th of that year, John attended 21 yoga classes in attempts to see Olga. One of the owners of the yoga studio had noticed John had started attending classes, but usually a bit later in the morning. The owner was not aware that John was Olga's ex-husband, and he said that John was out of shape and really struggled to keep up. That he had the impression he wasn't there to get exercise in because he was always looking around and not paying attention. The owner said that he got the feeling that John was a creep and only attended classes to look at women, which also might be true. But anyway, on February 8th of 2017, Olga attended the class she usually did, which was at 6 a.m. She entered the room and laid down on the mat she always did. The owner of the studio then entered the room and noticed Olga, but then also saw that John was in the class as well, but in the back row behind Olga. Olga eventually stood up on her mat while doing some stretching, and she looked into the mirror. This is when she saw John standing about 6 feet or 2 meters away from her, just staring directly at her. Scared out of her mind, Olga immediately told the owner that her ex-husband is there and she needs to go. Olga left the room very fast and drove right to the police station to report what just happened. Nothing came from this report, though. The owner of the studio had a rule that you couldn't leave once class started, and so he knew something must have been really wrong. He thought that Olga said something about her neck, but she was actually saying her ex. John stayed in the yoga class after Olga left, but the owner saw that he wasn't paying attention and kept looking at other women. After this class was over, The owner walked up to John and said, "I don't know what you are here for, but you are making people uncomfortable. Please don't come back." John then left and never came back. The owner had misheard what Olga had said originally and didn't realize that John was her ex-husband, so he had no idea the extent of the problem. A few hours would pass, and at about 10 a.m., Olga called the owner of the yoga studio and told him that she left class because her ex-husband was in the room. Traveling back about 2 months or so, and in December of 2016, John attempted to become a member of 2 different gun clubs. On December 13th, he filled out a form that allows him to use a gun range, but he ticked no to whether or not he's at a DVO and if he's suffering from any mental illness or disorder that could prevent him from using a firearm safely. He very much lied. A few more months would go by, and on February 8th of 2017, the same day that he stalked his ex-wife at her yoga class, he then submitted 2 applications to get a rifle permit and a pistol permit. Another month later, and on March 18th, John was given permits for both of the gun clubs. Now, it's not exactly clear as to what happened or why this occurred, but one of the gun clubs started to develop some concerns about John and decided that they were not going to offer him a membership. This gun club then called the other gun club as well, and they both decided to deny John entrance. About a month later, in April and May of 2017, John started attending another gun club. This one allowed him to stay, and he was reissued a pistol license permit to allow him to start training. On May 11th and the 22nd, he submitted forms to try and get a rifle license and pistol license again. This time, he was somehow given them regardless of his past. Between April to July of 2017, Olga and the children began to see a psychologist and tell them all about how evil John was and the awful conditions which they endured. Several months would go by, and in February of 2018, reality would shift completely. On February 14th, a court hearing happened between Olga, the children, and John. The judge ordered that Olga would have sole parental responsibility for both of the children and that they were to live with her. There was also nothing stating that either children had to spend time with John. John was allowed to receive school report cards and talk to their teachers, with the only case being that Olga and the children were not there. The judge also ordered for Olga to set up appointments for both of the children to see a psychologist again. The only time that John would be allowed to be with the children is if the children had written into the court asking for it to be allowed. Other than that, nope. He wasn't going to be allowed to see his children pretty much ever again. And John, around this time, began to come up with a devious plan. A plan that would end in pure carnage. A few months would go by, and on March 13th of 2018, John went to a gun shop and bought a .357 Magnum revolver. About a month later, on April 17th, John went to the same gun shop and bought a Glock 17A semi-automatic pistol and some ammunition. He was getting prepared. On June 25th, John called a car rental company to book a car from Monday, July 2nd to Saturday, July 18th. The next day, on June 27th, he called a mobile phone technician to get help with deleting all of his information from his laptop, deleting a hard drive from his other computer, and transferring some things to a flash drive. About a week would go by, and on July 3rd, this technician came out to John's house and helped him transfer some files, delete a bunch of things off of his laptop, and also delete the hard drive of another computer. As to what he was hiding or trying to get rid of, I don't think we'll ever know. But a day before this, John had went to the car rental company and picked up a white sedan. The reason that he rented this car was because he didn't want anyone, specifically his children, knowing that it was him driving. On July 4th, John went to the gun range he was allowed to attend and grabbed his Glock 17A pistol and his .357 Magnum revolver and a bunch of ammunition. Other people that were at the range said he appeared to be very angry at the time and closed the locker so hard that it became jammed. John then went home and got himself ready. The next day, on July 5th of 2018, a little bit before 7:30 a.m., Olga drove her daughter Jennifer to the train station to catch a train to her school. Afterwards, Olga drove back home and woke up Jack to tell him to get ready for school. She then dropped him off at about 8:50 a.m. and then started driving to work. Little did Olga know that this would be the last time she would ever see her children. At about 10:15 a.m., John went to one of his friend's houses and gave him a large envelope that had 2 extra envelopes stapled to it. John told his friend that this was in case anything bad happened to him, and he told him not to open the package. About 15 minutes would go by, and at 10:30 a.m., John spoke to one of his neighbors and asked him if he could return the spare key he gave them, because he apparently lost his own key and he needed to get some spares made. John gave them the key originally because they watched his dogs while he was away. The neighbor had thought that John asking for the key was weird because he saw John going in and out of his house numerous times already that day, but he gave it to him anyway. Nearly 2 hours later, John then drove to his second wife Carol's house and dropped off a bunch of boxes and a wooden chest that was hers that he held on to for 30 years. Carol wasn't home at the time and had no idea John was doing that. But anyway, this is where things get really bad. A few hours would pass, and at about 3:15 p.m., John left his home in the rental car. He took the Glock pistol with him, a bunch of ammunition, and a crowbar. John then drove and parked in a parking lot that was right across the street from the same train station his daughter used. He got there at about 3:26 p.m. He was sitting there for about an hour or so, watching, waiting. At 4:40 p.m., Jennifer got off of the train and then boarded a bus to go home. John saw her do all of this and then followed the bus to her house. At 4:50 p.m., Jennifer got off of the bus and started walking to her home, which was about 8 minutes away. When she arrived at 4:58 p.m., as she was walking through the front door, she noticed her father John pull in right behind her. Immediately, she ran in the front door, locked it, dropped her bag and laptop, and then went to her brother Jack's room. Jack was home already, and he was in his bedroom, sitting at his desk playing Fortnite. Jennifer told Jack about John, and so they both started hiding under Jack's desk. Jennifer curled up into a fetal position while Jack tried to protect her. Meanwhile, John kicked down the front door and eventually made his way to Jack's room. John then opened fire on his children, killing both of them practically instantly. He shot Jack 19 times and Jennifer 31 times. That's not just shooting someone, but obliterating them. Absolutely horrible. And this literally took him only 2 minutes. Afterwards, a neighbor heard these gunshots and decided to go check out what happened. This neighbor saw a man, aka John, walking out of the front door of Olga's home. This man then got into his car, and the neighbor asked him if everything was all right, but John didn't answer, and he just left. The neighbor then went inside of the home a little bit and yelled out, "Is everything okay?" But nobody answered. Next, the neighbor left the home and went to talk to a different neighbor, and both of them thought that these loud noises were gunshots. The neighbors then went to Olga's house and were a bit concerned because their dog didn't run outside. And normally, if the doors were open, the dog would run outside. Scared, These neighbors called the police at 5:20 p.m. 5 different police officers would arrive at the house at 5:34 p.m. They walked inside of the home and saw all of Jennifer's items on the ground, and they started yelling out to see if anyone was there. Eventually, one of the officers reached Jack's room and opened the door and yelled, "Police!" The light in Jack's room was on, and there was a desk with a computer, but the officer didn't see anyone. All of the officers then went back to the kitchen, which is where they found the family dog, who was shaking in fear in the corner of the room. A more thorough search was then done, and at 5:40 p.m., another officer went into Jack's bedroom and also saw the desk, which was on the left-hand side, and saw the computer monitor with Fortnite on it. This officer, however, noticed that something was sticking up between the desk and the wall, and that's when he quickly realized that something terrible happened. What he saw was one of the children's hands. The officer then looked under the desk and was shocked by what he saw. At this exact same time, Olga just arrived home and was trying to get inside of her house. An officer then stopped her and she asked, "What are you doing in my house? Why are you here?" Olga then understood what was happening after crime scene tape was being put up, and at 5:55 p.m., a paramedic declared both Jack and Jennifer deceased. Olga started crying and yelling out that it was her husband, John, who did this because they had their final court hearing in 2 weeks. Meanwhile, John went back to his home, and a little bit after 6 p.m., he cowardly took himself out with his .357 Magnum revolver. The police would find his body the next day on July 6th at about 6:18 a.m., and also a bunch of shredded documents, a burned tablet, and a burned phone. John also left a post-it note, and written on it, he said, "Justice delayed is justice denied," and a letter to Olga on a USB drive, basically blaming her for the children's deaths. At the foot of John's bed, he put a black t-shirt that said, "World's Greatest Dad," which is obviously not true. If anything, he was the complete opposite. To make this already sad story just a bit more upsetting, Olga ended up taking her life about 6 months later in December of 2018. She could no longer bear the pain and guilty feelings and sadly just couldn't handle it. Truly an ending that nobody wants or ever expects. John Edwards was an evil man who wasn't going to stop until he got what he wanted, and he did. For some reason, he wanted to murder his innocent children after already treating them like garbage for their entire lives. This man for many years was awful to women and his children, and I feel bad for anyone that ever came into contact with him. We all know that he's rotting away, but Jennifer Edwards was born in 2004 and was considered to be herself and a quiet person. She adored literature and could spend hours getting lost into it. Jennifer was very happy because she got accepted into the high school she wanted, and she was really good at school. She loved going ice skating and watching her dog Max and pet rabbit. Jennifer wanted to become a veterinarian later down the line. Jack Edwards was born in September of 2002 and was considered to be a very active and free-spirited child. He loved soccer and playing Fortnite. Jack had a bunch of good friends in high school, and he was very articulate and intelligent. He was very protective over his mother and sister, which clearly showed in the end. Olga Edwards was a very hardworking and devoted mother who wanted the absolute best for her children. Unfortunately, she was dealing with a lunatic ex-husband who wasn't going to stop until he got what he wanted. Olga will be remembered as an incredibly smart and brave woman who did what she had to do to try and protect her children. I really hope that all of them are resting peacefully. But anyways, thank you for watching this episode of High Time Crime. If true crime is your thing, then please subscribe and hit the like button because that's all we do. Another thing is that recently I started an all-exclusive Patreon. Here, you're given the choice of 3 tiers, and the last one allows for a Patreon-only video that's uncensored. That and the second tier allow you to have your name at the end of each High Time Crime video. This is just in case you want to support me a little further. I hope you have a great rest of your day. Take care, friend.